Now that you have the general idea down, let's go over an example. Say there's a part of your app that presents users with a preferences page and allows them to choose between two app themes, daytime and midnight. If you set your preference to the midnight theme, you'd probably want the app to remember that, so you don't have to reset it every time upon app launch. So this would be a good place to use NSUser defaults. Your device has a defaults database where it stores everything from system-wide defaults to language defaults to app-specific defaults and more. App-specific defaults is what we'll be focusing on. To access the values from this database, we'll need to call standard user defaults from an NSUser defaults object, which will return the shared defaults object that we need. Notice I said shared object. That means the NSUser defaults class has a class method that will return a reference to the same user defaults object regardless of where we invoke it in our program. This is called the singleton design pattern. Once we have the shared user defaults object, we can then use keys to get values for this defaults object, just like a dictionary. In this example, we'll use the method value for key, but there are other methods available as well, such as string for key, bool for key, float for key, and others. In this example, we'll want to keep a value that lets us know whether the midnight theme is off or on, so it makes sense to use a boolean here. So we'll first check to see if a boolean value already exists for the string midnight theme on using the if-let syntax, in case it doesn't. So let's first suppose the app has no idea what we're talking about, it's never heard of midnight theme on, and this is our first time launching the app. So here's where we'll set it. Setting a value in NSUser defaults is very similar to checking for a value, and the syntax is set value with a value, and then the key string we'll want to use to retrieve it. So in our case, this will be a bool, so we'll say false, because no one has flipped the midnight theme on yet, and for key, we'll put in that midnight theme on string. So we know that if this else statement is being executed, it's because our call to value for key up here returned nil, meaning no value had been set for that key string. So this also shows us that the app has never been launched before, because if it had, it'd have a value for midnight theme on. So let's just add a print that shows us that this is the app's very first launch. And we know that after this first launch, we will now have a value for NSUser defaults for that midnight theme on key. So let's go back up here and deal with this case. That is the case where value for key midnight theme on returns a value. So we know that since we're using value for key, it's returning an any object. So the first thing we need to do is cast this to a bool. Then we can check its value. If it is true, we'll call a method called switch to midnight, which makes all the UI changes necessary to show the midnight theme. If it's false, we don't really need to do anything because the UI is set to load with the daytime theme in general. But let's just add some print statements in here so we can see what's happening when. Okay, so now I just need to set up an action for when the switch gets flipped. Let me do that now. So when this action gets executed, I check my switch outlet to see whether it's turned off or on. And then I call the appropriate UI configuration method. And it's here that I want to update my new preference in my user defaults. So I'll add in a set value here to true for midnight theme on, and if the theme switch is set to off, I'll put in a set value here to false for midnight theme on. So this should work to save our preference. Let's try it out. Now let's switch to midnight theme, and let's see what happens when we close the app. On a device, you can view all your open apps by pressing the home button twice in rapid succession, and then you can close an app from there. We can simulate this action on your simulator by holding Command-Shift and rapidly pressing the H key twice. So Command-Shift-HH, and just like on a device, I can swipe up to close it. Now let's relaunch our app, and great, we see that our preference is saved. Let's switch back to daylight and close it again. Awesome, it saved our daylight preference. But how come it didn't print "this is the first launch ever" when we first ran it? Well, because I had run this app with the NSUser defaults already implemented when I showed you the demo. So how do we simulate running this app as if it was the first time it's ever been launched on our device? What we need to do is reset the content and settings of our simulator. We'll end up doing this a lot throughout the course, so we've included the directions for this step in the accompanying text as well. It's pretty simple though. We just click Simulator and then Reset Content and Settings, and that's it. Now we can launch the app as if it's the first time it's on our device. And now we get this output that says, "This is the first launch ever." So let's switch the midnight theme on. Let's close the app. Let's relaunch. And we see our preferences saved. So awesome, but there's actually an even better place to put all this code, and that's in our app delegate. So I've made this method called checkIfFirstLaunch, which does a similar thing to what our code in our viewDidLoad method did, except for the primary focus is not whether the theme has been set or not, but in a more general sense, whether the app has ever launched before. So similar to the code in our viewDidLoad method, we have bool for key has launched before to check if the app has ever launched. And if it hasn't, we know that this is the first launch, and in this else section, we can set the bool for has launched before to true. And here we'll also set the default value for Midnight theme on, so that we know it's taken care of for the rest of the app. And then we can go back here and delete some of this section and see that the app still works. We no longer need to check if there's a value for We Want Midnight because we know that there is because we set it in the app delegate, which launches first. And you can see how this would be preferred because then you can make sure things are set up at app launch rather than at view load. And let's run it one more time. But first, let's reset the content and settings. And launch. And switch to Midnight. Let's close our app. Relaunch. And we see that our preference is saved. Awesome.